Okay, so hello everybody. It's nice to see you. I am Jen Jackie King, and this is Queering New York. We're up to Street Life, and I'm so excited to have you all back. Starting at 7 today, ending at 9, of course with follow-up drinks, and we are also online, hi everybody. And if you want to chat on the live stream, or if not, you can talk on the Twitter with the hashtag @CLAGSQNY. And I hope everybody got the Delaney. You brought me this really gorgeous.
I didn't know how to print it out right, and that's what my computer did.
So you queered Delaney. I think beautiful. Really. So as usual, let's kick it off with names and go around. So I'm Jack.
Colin.
Sarah. Hannah. Yana. Mike. Rebecca. Cookie. Kate.
Ken.
Julian.
Trina.
Catherine. Amanda. Gwen. Karen.
Alex.
Meredith. Dominique. Wyvie.
Andrew.
Nick.
Phil.
Mark.
Yasmina. Kate.
Nico.
Nicole. Lucia.
Everybody. Normalizing mornings. So, streets, out of the bars and into the streets. Here we are. We did it. Wow, that's great. So, I don't know if you knew, but that was Harvey Milk's slogan in San Francisco in the 70s. And he just thought that was great. I don't know if you read the quote from Jane Jacobs about that I wrote for the pre-class thread, but she was just obsessed with the city street, right? She thought that that's where life was, and we read a lot about her in the first class, especially in New York. There's so much happening in the street. I was really practicing my dyke nod, like making eye contact, and I don't think it works the same way for gay men. I don't think I would call it that at all. I think it'd be cruising. But I thought we could talk about that as one thing that's not talked about a lot. I don't know if any work on the dyke nod, and there's I don't know if there's tons on cruising. You're reading. I think there's more and more recently, but historically, Chauncey and Delaney are really great examples of that. Delaney, I felt it was so hard because it's two halves of one beautiful, exquisite book. And I assigned the really academic part, and there's a whole really great sex part that's just all about sex in Times Square and movie district. So it's kind of a tease, because now you probably want to go back and read what that was all about, or I was hoping you would. He's such a beautiful writer. And Chauncey, who has such great analysis to go back through decades of police records, and in a way how sad it is to make a history through our police arrests, and how absent women are, and that shows up in a lot of really historic work on gay men. There'll be a footnote, I looked for women and they weren't there, and why and how. I'm excited to hear what you think about that. And also about how this whole social structure of gay male life formed in these spaces. He's so beautifully, eloquently tells you these great stories and quotes. And then in a totally different realm, we have the fabulous Jay Toole being interviewed by Anya Dugan. Nobody should ever feel the way I felt, which reminded me of the So Too With Me idea that we ended the first class with, about going back, or the second class, about going back for the people who are left. And about how poverty really affects us all, and affects queer life and LGBTQ life. So I was wondering, and especially juxtaposing these pieces, which since someone asked, Sarah asked last time, why did you put these pieces together? It was really to juxtapose these things. Weirdly enough, I never see anyone teach Chauncey with Delaney, but I think they go together so well across time. And then I love Jay Toole's very other story about the streets. So what were people's thoughts? Yeah.
It was wonderfully productive, because I'm trying to think a little bit about homelessness, and homelessness is partly about not having a place where people can find you, and there are all these deprivations of social services too. And on the other hand, so you live in the streets and you don't have a place. On the other hand, that's exactly what the gay men wanted. They wanted a place where they're gay and then they could be, but separate. from all their other identities. And this very elaborate system,
The Chauncey system.
the Chauncey system, was
Yeah.
very much about meeting people without knowing much about them, and despite all the stories about people meeting long-term relationships there, it was basically the streets facilitated anonymity because you would never see people again. You would see them only when there was this code of silence about who you really were.
Right.
In the first page, it talks about sound thrashing or an empathetic kicking, and I thought if that was literal today, that'd be a hate crime, you know? And then, I mean, when I come here, I change on 34th Street and I take the bus across, and this is the site of 3 hate crimes in the last maybe 2 weeks, and one crime involved a broken nose, another involved eye surgery, and it's just shocking that this notion of public and private and the notion of violence, how it, you know, maybe Ranger fans go on a spree or something, I don't know.
And it still permeates everyday LGBT life. It was interesting studying Park Slope. There were actually a lot of attacks in the history of Park Slope against women, against lesbian queer women. In the 1997, there were a lot of women who would get like, oh, could you give me directions? And they would come up to a car and grabbed and then dragged along the car. I mean, there was always like a kind of like a series of something happening there. And there's a lot that's not reported. I mean, no one can even guess how much we don't report to the AVP. Again, I read this, sorry. Anybody else on Chauncey? Did you dig it? I think he's the bee's knees. I'm very biased. I've read this book like 7 times. The whole book is so delicious. You're like, no way, it's great.
I was gonna say, I think I mentioned last week, I study queer history, so I've read this piece a lot because Gay New York is like the book that I was just telling Rebecca, like if you take a US history class, it's like the one gay book that people throw in, so it's something I've read a lot. And so, but every time really different things stick out to me, and this time what stuck out to me was there was that paragraph about a men's beauty competition.
Oh, yeah.
This in 1929 in Coney Island,
Yeah.
and like most of the men in the audience seemed queer, most of the contestants were, and you know, I mean, I feel like the only time Coney Island feels queer is during like the mermaid parade. You know? I was like trying to like imagine what that would be like now, you know. And so, and I think a lot of that has to do with like class and how Coney Island is class. And I think one of the really interesting things about Gay New York is how a lot of it really is about like queer working class culture.
Yeah.
And yeah, they kind of like they talk there about the fairies versus the queers, and queers was like a term for the middle class gays, and fairies tend to be more working class or rough trade.
Right.
Yeah, so I think that's pretty fascinating.
I'm shocked to find marriage coming up in all 3 of these pieces. Of all things I didn't expect. I forgot that he mentions marriage and the bourgeoisie expecting this kind of like married life. That they thought how horrible it was to just have these affairs, even then. So, not that they think so now. I love you.
I also thought, I think it was in the Chauncey piece where he was talking about how there were so many like immigrants and working class people living in tenements, and everyone was out on the street. It wasn't just the gays, it was like straight people who were out there too, because if you wanted to have sex or, you know, just do anything, the only place you could go was to the rooftop or to the park. So it was just a whole scene of everybody, you know, carrying on outside.
What were you gonna say?
I was just thinking about how there's, you know, there were all of these sorts of codes where folks were, you know, could identify each other but be largely invisible to the street world. And I was thinking about how technology is really kind of fulfilling that function now, like how everyone's like on Grindr or on Scruff or whatever, like going like this, and everyone thinks like you're texting or just checking your email, but you're like doing this like totally like looking for sex thing in a way that's like not, that's like maybe not read that way unless you're queer, or you're like, oh, I bet they're on Grindr now. Yeah, just like sort of how like technology is like rendering cruising less public in some ways in the city now, but it's still dependent on this like big population of queer people in a small spot for like the crowdsourcing stuff to work. But that maybe we need that more now since we have like the desexualization of all of these spaces like Times Square has meant that it's like harder to go outside and find sex. Like we have to like go on our computers to find it.
Someone might be less willing to fight because they can go on Grindr and just subvert it without even trying. Right? Or,
I wondered if that sort of connects to networking versus contact. How now we're sort of networking online to find partners, especially things like OkCupid. It's like finding my soulmate via networking and, you know, testing out possibilities and all this sort of thing versus the street space where it was more of a casual encounter that became a long life friendship or a long-term relationship even. So.
In partly personal observation, one of the things that happens with the computer is that you can sort of contact people from all over the world. And then, this happens to me because I'm not on Grindr, but let's say Match.com, right? So I get these message from Paris and and I'm going like, what the fuck is this about? Whereas if you were going to a bar or a gym or a bath, except for tourists, it would be a local crowd and you actually could meet people that you could see again. So I think there's something actually destructive about the fantasy of meeting somebody half world away online.
right. Which is what they sell to us, like all the commercials are. And I met her from Hawaii and it was magical and we wrote for years. How horrible that must have been. Or how magical that must have been. Go, please.
I think although that's a decision about how to use the technology, and I don't think that's how everyone uses it. I certainly feel like that for me, OkCupid has worked best when it's like, this is someone that I've seen in real life, and then I'm like, oh, I recognize you, and now I know that you like these things, and you're single, or you're available, or whatever. And so it is still like seeing people in person and local versus, and you can make those choices versus like Paris.
It goes back to last week, we were talking about how activism seems a lot safer now as opposed to back in the day, and how it's a lot safer to find someone online who doesn't possibly get picked up by the police or be doing like an illegal activity in a park versus being able to meet someone at a bar and meet them on screen them first. And so it has, our world has gotten as queer as in some ways not as harsh and not as hard. I think that the online thing makes it easier as well.
I never hear about the police on Grindr. I never hear about, they're not policing that space yet.
There's a Tumblr called Grindr Police.
But they're just obnoxious guys.
Racist guys.
Yeah. Racist. Yeah.
But I think
I hate that.
But you know that sooner or later there are going to be privacy concerns, whether it's wholesale or whether it's people going after, it's sexting. Andrew Weiner is one example of what happened. And this is going to happen over and over because now you have all these records of what you said about yourself and the other person. And people, I think, actually have lost control of their privacy, even though it seems very private.
And it's interesting on Grindr how many people ask for a face picture. I won't talk to you unless there's a face picture. But then there's the concern over privacy, but not. So, you have to move in the same circles of people who don't want pictures, face pictures or not.
I think that was part of Delaney's point about safety, though, is that we've become so safety concerned that we have this illusion of safety when we go online and we look at someone's statistics and so that's going to be honest, which many times it isn't. And so I think that sort of creates sort of a, I'm not sure if it's really safer. I don't really know. I'm not sure.
And if you don't know the rest of this, but Delaney spent most of, 10, 20 years hanging out in Times Square when it was all these great porn theaters, or he describes it in this very great way. And he makes sure not to be nostalgic, he makes sure not to romanticize things. He was just very happy there, and he had a community and a life and a lot of really amazing sex, and saw a lot of really amazing sex happen. And it was a whole world, and it also supported one another, and a lot of it was about this cross-class contact. Which, as ideas go, we're getting very few ideas from the readings about how things can change. We see a lot of problems, or we find a lot of history of things, but this is a real idea about how things can change. And we've talked about how things go back to capitalism, and he starts out with, with saying, given the state of capitalism in the present moment, so he's actually dealing with that right now. And if, for those of you who haven't been to Times Square and aren't in the room lately, it's like Disney World, so we should say that. We're all nodding. You're a fan also?
No. I think it's worth noting that all of these pieces are in their own way a little dated, though. Delaney's is from the 97. Yeah, but that's sort of pre economic crisis. So there's even a sort of different.
Well, 2008 before COVID.
Well, what
Oh, it's
year was that?
2012.
2011.
Oh, that order. Okay.
Yeah.
But some of the analysis there is referring to a pre and post economic crisis, without clarifying the changes that happened at the time. So I think it's really informative to look back at the past, say, 20 or 30 years, and then also look back to the beginning of the 20th century, but also know that there are really dramatic changes happening now, especially as the economy improves, and you have the city changing as rapidly as it is, and things like the homelessness problem is disappearing, is being hidden even further.
Right, there are more homeless shelters closing than ever before, and yet there are ads up that if you need help to call in. Actually, try not to go to a shelter. I saw an ad for that, like to try not to go to a shelter, call here for help.
Yeah.
To try and keep people out of shelters.
There was something about in order to be accepted in a shelter, like you have to explain that you try to stay with your friends or relatives, and this was a few months ago when they were talking about if you are planning to stay at a shelter, like you should make sure that everybody has said no. And I don't know how can they check that everybody said no. But
Was that like for economic reasons or for like sanity or?
No, this was for because they don't have space.
Yeah.
So it's saying that try first every other option.
Right.
And I guess the idea is that people don't try every other, like somebody is just like, yeah, I'm not gonna stay with my friends, I'm gonna go to
I'm
the
sure
shop.
that's
I mean, it's.
Yeah. Was there a hand up back there?
Well, when you're thinking about change and kind of the shift from in-person communication to online communication, Delaney's point about rhetoric and how that is, and discourse and how to change that, like the shift between, rhetoric in person and then now it being online and what written discourse and rhetoric and how maybe what the differences are, how that has changed, because I also think, I think someone made the point about kind of this kind of dehumanization with online life and communication, so I wonder, how, maybe whether that's successful or not. And
Or if anybody likes it, we should hear from you too, that's great.
I'll just observe a difference with it. I'm sorry, I'm talking a lot, so I should be careful. But there are different sites, and a lot of the gay male match sites really are turn yourself into pornography sites, in which the first thing you often see, you may never see anything but genitalia on those sites. And then there's something like Match.com or other ones, which have very different discourse, because you don't find out. You can't tell what people's sexual preferences are until you ask. And there's this really, in Match.com, this kind of really cutesy framework, which feels like it's aimed at, his story, your history, and, it feels like it's aimed at middle-aged suburban women, frankly. And
OkCupid is aimed at the hipster-ish.
I'll go check it out now that I know. But they have very different discourses, and I particularly, not that I think there's anything terribly wrong with pornography, but if all people are doing on those sites is looking at other people's genitals or videos and them with sex acts, that's not the same as a dating site. That's, in a way, more akin to a lot of what Chauncey described.
Which part?
Well, in all the anonymous encounters in whatever it was, alcoves and restrooms and so on.
And you still see these same kind of structures of life, or you can still see the same comfort stations closed now, right? Or you can still see the same bathrooms. Every time I see a subway bathroom, I'm like, oh, I know what happened there, or imagine what happened there. And he talks about this maintenance of the moral order and the kind of really great tactics that people would do to get around things. And the internet, in a way, and all this and a lot of what mobile devices are a way to get around things. I think, I can't remember the number from that study, but it's something like 28% of queer youth have used their phone, I'm sorry if I'm not getting this right, within the last 24 hours to get around the police or something. That's amazing. And they're texting each other in their networks. They're having these kind of networks that Jay Toole talks about, where she never turns off her phone because she's, kind of hub for everyone.
I think in terms of rhetoric online, like I saw one ad on the subway from Lee.com and it said, fall in love, and then the next one was stay in love. And so it was this sort of a whole find something that's really going to last and have this sort of normative experience. So I think it sort of functions on different levels. It can function as sort of a, superficial. They're all different sorts of rhetoric, I think, with online, meeting people online and that sort of format.
Right, and the identities you have to fit into those.
I don't know who we is, if it's a queer friendly or it might not be at all.
Right.
I have no
I
idea.
mean, eHarmony wasn't, of course, run by religious, right, very Christian. And then the group
People
of
to sue, right?
the LGBTQ people sued them, and they created
They were forced to create like a.
something partners, something hopeful, something really lame. Sorry, hopeful partners or something. I don't know. It's something that's just like, it doesn't sound like it's actually going to work out for everybody.
But helpful.
Yeah. Hopeful.
Compatible partners.
Compatible partners. Right? So that's what those people sued and got instead. Which I thought was a really weird thing to sue a site to get another site for some kind of equal version of something. Compatible partners.
One thing I was thinking about with the, kind of going off of what people have been saying about how things have changed with the internet and off of what Delaney is talking about is the way that using technology doesn't only make us stay in the home, but it makes the experience of being on the street so much different because everyone's just staring at a screen.
Oh.
Like I remember when everyone first got a cell phone, I didn't have one yet, and I'd just be like, I'm never just gonna have a spontaneous conversation with someone on the street anymore because everyone is just like staring at a screen or on, has earbuds and like which people didn't used to have quite as much, although there was Walkmans and everything. But I just think it's interesting to think about how technology, the fact that we're always on it, like changes our experience of being on the street itself now too.
Mm-hmm. And the iPod did that first. I mean, we all kind of like buckled in.
Yeah.
And we were all listening to some great, one of our 10,000 songs. And that took away that made a lot of isolation and eliminated a lot of conversation too. And that kind of contact. And then we see more inequality happening, but these are the kind of things that are also supporting it in the everyday because we're not interacting and having that contact. But we are networking more and more. Look at all the friends we have.
So I feel like we talked about it, but so I really don't believe in technological determinism, and so I don't think that's really true.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think there are lots of ways in which it can make you safer. I think like I also you like are harassed on the street constantly, and that having the earbuds in is a way to like be slightly safer and not yelling back at people. And I wouldn't be having like more interactions. I would be more scared of having interactions if I didn't have the ways to be very cut off. And I feel very sure that I'm not alone in that. So I think anyway, I don't think it creates that.
Experience.
Right, no, I believe you. But, yeah.
And when people can like screen for partners that are way online that you can't always screen otherwise. So in some ways it's like there's some safety things, but I don't know, I think it's really interesting that like the way that Chauncey talks about how there's like this sort of interclass thing happening as well with people cruising, and that like in some ways or he's like saying that orientation is one of the few things that can trump class, or create this interclass contact. And Chauncey and Delaney sort of said the same thing. But now that we don't, is the internet in response to not having these spaces, and maybe Craigslist or Adam for Adam is a place where we I feel like I have tons of friends that are like, oh my god, I just banged a professor at Yale, and and they're like somebody who they might not meet in regular life or something like that. And so I think that I don't know if it's maybe it's just interclass contact is happening virtually in kind of cool. I think I'm sort of a person who likes the CDN interclass stuff that's happening online, even though obviously there needs to be I'm very happy for places that aren't just totally hook up the online too. It's nice to be able to have meaningful relationships there too. And I think I'm obviously speaking from somebody who I think for queer people who are women or trans people, I think that there's a little different online culture than there is with gay men as well. So I'm also an outsider, I think, to some of the I'll make a profile on Scruff and then be oh damn, I can't do very much on here, but but I think that maybe it's filling the places where we don't physically have anymore, and that those places can be really messed up in a lot of ways, and and really racist in a lot of ways, and obviously can create some public health concerns in the city as well. But I don't think that they're necessarily all bad, and I think it's just kind of doing what we used to have.
Yeah, and it's something that Chauncey says too, like, we're filling in the crevices. Like he talks about these ways of like getting around and finding all these ways of doing things, and then some people say, oh, I really miss when we all hung out at the bar, or I really miss when we were all in the ramble, and but it was kind of a finding another way to meet, because there was so much oppression, and now we're finding other ways of meeting. But the rate of acceptance is back, or tolerance. It's not tolerance anymore. We've actually moved on to acceptance above 50%. In the U.S., and that's really, really low in the 80s, and actually it was in the high 40s in the 70s, which is something people don't know about. By the late 70s, after 1973, the DSM-3, or homosexuality is a mental disorder, there actually was a climb and increase in acceptance, right? And then AIDS, and this huge dip, and then back again. We're just passing that level in the last few years.
Yeah, it's similar to what you were saying. I was actually thinking, people have brought up a lot about instances of class and thinking about that in the Chauncey reading. Yeah. I was actually really thinking about race or ethnicity in the Chauncey reading, and because you had this, like, I imagine that still sort of racial hierarchies still existed even then, and so I wonder to what extent there was this like interracial hookups, and I think that it sounds like there was like a German guy and an Irish guy and an Italian guy hooking up, and sort of like when they weren't white, right? So like that idea around that. I just wonder how those places, like, did people know, like, if you wanted to hook up with like a black guy, like, where did that happen, or did that happen at all? Or if even in the rambles there were pockets of where sort of like
or was
Latino
that the great mixing pot or something?
Right, and sort of how that played out in all these other sort of oppressive spaces. And so I was just thinking about that, because I do wonder what stories aren't told there, like how did they play out, or were there additional consequences, or were they, and I would imagine that people of color in those cruising places would probably be sort of picked up first, right? And so I think about how those things play out, and it doesn't say that in the piece, and I'm sure someone's researching and writes about that, but I didn't see that there, and I thought it was really fascinating.
And it's in the arrest record, so we have all of that. That's something.
Yeah, I think following both of those, what I was thinking about was, I do think like Grindr and Scruff, it's just another kind of structure for this type of contact, right? That there's still interclass contact through Grindr, Scruff, and apps like that. But my question was, right, thinking about race and class, right? Delaney, in his piece where he's talking about the sex, he does talk more about interracial hookups, and he does, he sees these spaces as promoting something liberatory almost because of that contact. But I think tracing this history from like Chauncey to Delaney to even apps now, we see that just because there's contact, it doesn't mean that suddenly there's no value given to class or race, right? Like, we can have these contacts as much as we want, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the person's gonna leave with a racial conscience or class.
Right, just like that website, what did you Grindr Police? Grindr Police.
Right.
Because of all the racist classes. There's thin and stuff on there, yes?
Yeah, kind of going off what you were saying, I used to look at, it's a fun game to look at the Craigslist misconnections, and you compare them via city too, because you really get to see kind of how gender and what people are looking for is locational. But I think one of the things I would see a lot is there's a lot of transphobia, there's a lot of racism, There's a lot of classism, I don't want to talk to you if you don't have a job, or if you're, on welfare, things like that. And this is totally prevalent now. You see it in New York, I compare New York, Boston, and San Francisco, and LA.
Is there still a no butches thing on Craigslist?
No, but people say
that was in the late 2000s. That was the thing. No
it's still around. Here in New York, it's really popular. It's no butches, no girls that look like boys, only femmes. There's this whole thing of only femmes, only girly girls, real women, and that's really, really prevalent. And I think that shows that these things are not dealt with. They're very
Well, something that really struck me about the Chauncey reading was the fact that
like effeminate men were so much more likely to be policed. And obviously because, you know, there's this visibility thing, there's also like they couldn't be normal men. Obviously there are fairies, and I think it's interesting how that's kind of, it seems to me like kind of moved from the job of the police to do that regulation to like gay men on Grindr. It's like the same thing, but it's just like we're doing it to each other now.
I think to add to the Craigslist thing would be a lot of people are looking for people who are bi-curious or like bi-curious and looking for this, and I think that's kind of like the essence that you're talking about. You know, even if you didn't identify as gay or anything like that, but you kind of wanted to dabble, you knew you could walk into this restaurant and somebody might be there to pick you up. And now Craigslist is kind of the space for like women who are like, I'm bi-curious, but then I don't want, you know, a butcher or anything like that.
Yeah, two thoughts. With the internet connections and the hookups, there's still this question of where you actually go to have sex. Whereas in these earlier iterations, that problem was solved because it was somewhere. And I'm not sure it's as safe in the sense that I guess one choice is a hotel, but I don't think those people are meeting, you know, in the subway station at DuPont Circle and having sex. I think they're going to somebody's place. So that's a different dynamic. The other thing, and it's probably a response to Colin's comment, is I think that while the kind of hookups that occur thanks to whatever meeting system it is, can sort of bypass race or class. As soon as you try to normalize the relationship by bringing somebody to meet friends, those issues reemerge immediately. So they only disappear so long as the relationship is not visible to the social context in which somebody lives.
Yeah, I was saying they don't disappear.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. I just want to say, it was funny when you said connections and hookups, I thought you were talking about like the internet, and I realized that I never realized how many metaphors there were there that were going on. Anyway, close.
I guess I was wondering about the networking versus contact. Like, do we see all internet interactions as networking, or could it be contact? And what, you know, I mean, I'm just wondering, like, because networking to me was the example of the writing conference, where you have this sort of idea that you're going to this conference in order to have certain things fulfilled. Similar to you go on a website with certain intentions, but maybe we don't. I mean, maybe it depends. I'm not sure. I just wondered if it could be a space of contact.
But if it is a space, it'll do both, right? If it's another kind of environment that we live in, then it can do both. There's this idea of digital dualism, like is the material really separate from the virtual, like the mind-body dualism. People are arguing not so much because we produced it and that's what we put out there. But there's something new and weird. There are new codes there.
I think that Delaney's distinction between contact and networking is hugely helpful to me. I was just at two very different conferences for law professors interested in property, and at one there were like 150 people, and there was this huge competition for, you know, pay attention, the more influential or senior people, pay attention to me. And then the other one was like 15 people, invitation only. Everybody presented and got helpful feedback. And that was contact. And so it's partly just a numbers game.
Or maybe it's an attitude. Like what I'm thinking about with the writers' conference is he says go there with the attitude of producing and sharing knowledge instead of getting something out of it. So maybe if we go on these sites thinking we're going to find our soulmate or we're going to find this amazing sexual encounter, then that's the mindset of networking versus contact, where you might meet a best friend. You might have something to happen totally unexpected. So maybe it's more of an attitude. I don't know.
And even with like queer studies scholars, I'm going to guess that more than half of the people attending the Homo Nationalism and Pinkwashing conference kind of calmed down once Judith Butler canceled and was not attending, right? You know, then it became like, oh, we're just like all sharing our work. But there was something, wouldn't you agree? Yeah, maybe. I think and that can happen in academic settings, and then some of them not. But I think, anyway, you were going to, yes, June?
Yeah, I know that there's this, I don't know if it's a new kind of rhetoric or something, but I know that there's a move for these websites to kind of link you with people in your area. And that just seems relevant to this conversation.
Right.
You know, it's not so much like, hey, do you like, you know, pizza and porn? You know, it's kind of like, are you around the corner?
Right.
Or are you in Uganda?
Right. Like you can geocode all your tweets now. I mean, like anybody who has a smartphone right now, like everybody knows where we are in the basement. Maybe not because of the basement of the building, but
But it's like a convenience thing.
No,
Like,
they don't. You can set it online.
online right now, 3 blocks away, you know?
Right.
Like, I think that's a new thing. Instead of like connecting on like interests or.
Oh, instead of shifting away maybe from identities too. Like moving into geographies.
I think it goes back to dueling conferences a little bit. Talking about self-regulation and kind of how that, it kind of is all about self-regulation and then the narrative that's crafted around that. So thinking about the various websites and, you know, how that shapes your expectations as to what you should or should not be and how you then kind of project yourself in that narrative too, and how, you know, whether that be in person and whether that does translate to being in person. So you have this online persona that you've shaped based on this kind of external pressure.
And your friends.
Right.
Weigh in, right.
Exactly. And then how that, like once you actually meet a person, how does that either stay consistent or not? And how does that kind of battle affect you as a person and the people you're with and contacting?
Right. So. Versus just going to these parks, it's just what you're wearing in a way, right? It's just how you act and what you wear and the codes you use that Chauncey talks about.
And is that simpler?
I'm starting,
You know, I mean,
for some people maybe. Yeah.
I'm starting to think of like maybe a parallel between networking and contact and OkCupid and Grindr, not to sort of like get too far along that path, but I think that like for me it has to do with actually the difference between how much of your sort of like so-called normal life you bring into these encounters and like how much you connect yourself with like the, I guess, like sexual or romantic investment that you put into it. And you know, because I think that my impression there's a lot more likelihood that a guy who's like straight but bi-curious will go on Grindr and try to meet dudes as opposed to OkCupid, because you can just be like a disembodied torso.
And you have to mark yourself as bisexual.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of like the same idea as going into a tea room and like going home to your wife, is that it's like not real if it's sort of like public and no one knows who you are.
Especially if you have a wife. Do you guys see contact?
I was just gonna, on top of that, I was thinking about how social networking often allows people to have these like constructed identities, and so it takes a really long time to create an OkCupid profile because you have to like put the right music interests and movies and all these other things, and how that's also a farce. Whereas, you know, if you went into a park, it was people were making assessments about you based on the way that you walk, talk, dress, and all these other things, but it's this sort of similar, like, I don't know, Darwinism of like made matching.
I would say there's definitely a constructed identity with public cruising though. I mean, there's lots of instances of people, you know, slumming it. So, you know, rich people dressing up in their leather and denim to go to places. If you're going to a park, you're still being read. You can still perform something as well. That it's, you know, the idea of a constructed identity coming with sexual attraction, I don't think is totally internet based. It's more involved because there's more of you have to put on more of a show. But even when it's being read physically, you can portray something for 3 hours for the sake of a sexual contact if it's what you're going after.
Right, and then you have this weird uniformity where you have like these leather parties or like there's around a certain theme, right? And so what did I get? There was this like boots and boxers party where everyone was wearing boots and boxers, right? And so it was like then you had like people who were like wearing boxer briefs, or like people who were like, you know, so it was just like that sort of. But yeah, I agree with that.
One of the things that the Chauncey piece also made me think about was, I think in so many ways, like I feel like I go to queer bars and I don't feel like the cops are gonna be there, and I go home and it's fine, and I think that there's all of these ways that like that also isn't really the truth even today. Like I think they were like, oh wow, I can't like imagine like being arrested every time I went out or risking that. And I was thinking about when I was like still gay for pay, and I was monitoring media in like 12 southern states, and there were a couple of TV stations like during like Sweep Sweep, which is in like November and February when they do the like KSL investigates men in parks, and like there'll be like a news guy like straight up in the bushes with a camera taping guys in the park, and then they bring the cops, they arrest them, and then this is like, I shit you not, this was like maybe like 4 years ago or something, and this one particular place, it was in Tennessee, that this TV station did this. They ended up, like the same way that this shit like happened back in the day when they'd arrest you and like put your name where you work, whatever, and you'd get fired. They printed, because like whatever, arrests are still like public record, and so they printed all these guys' mugshots and their names, their full names and their ages. One of the guys ended up committing suicide, and I was like reaching out to the news station and then to the newspaper that ended up printing all of this stuff. They took it from the TV station and printed like and they were like, oh, it's public record, like you guys are always fucking calling me. And I was like, well, you should treat this like any other like crime. Are you gonna like post the photo and the name and the age of like, you know, somebody who like stole one person's checkbook or something like that, you know, like no, you're not gonna do that. So I don't know, it's really interesting how I think we're still doing a lot of this stuff. And then the other talking points that were like given to me from like Gay Inc. were like, you know, you need to explain to the reporters that that most of these people don't identify as gay, that a lot of folks are married that are like seeking out contact in these public spaces. And I think there's a lot of truth to that in some ways, but I think that there's also this thing about like, it's this always like sanitizing like gay people. It's like gay people don't do that. Like only like repressed people do that. Like we're not allowed to like go have sex in public or something like that. And that's like that's, and so I think there's a lot of like, you know, we're not like the bad gays thing happening as well. But it was just strange how like I think a lot of the stuff that he was talking about still happens now. Like we saw like whatever Times Square getting cleaned up, but parks are still in some ways real, and the policing that still is really, really real and really tragic.
I just want to say it happens in so many other countries, right? Just
It
all
happens in
the
other
countries.
states, like
Yeah, other states, other countries, yeah, and we hear about people being hung in the square. Yeah. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, you know, also I think though there is still heavy policing going on, and it's whose bodies get policed in that way are people of color because they're hypersexualized. Right. And you know, you can walk in the village right now, and if you are stopped and frisked and you have a condom on you, you're arrested for solicitation. That's right. Here in New York. So, you know, when we're talking about these things of like walking and feeling safe and going to a queer bar and stuff, there actually is a very large amount of policing that goes on and hypersexualization. It just happens to people of color in the city.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to a lot about black male sexualization, black female sexualization is this ultra sexualization and fetishism that's used over and over to kind of control and ridicule. And in different ways, there's the feminization of Asian men, right? Right? And these kind of things are reproduced in media, and then how do they affect like our everyday contact networking too? As they do.
One thing I thought was interesting that Jay Toole mentioned was the idea of how people look at a woman on the street differently, or like a homeless woman on the street differently than men, which is, I think, definitely speaks to the idea of policing, the idea that the streets are still conceded as a male domain, and there isn't really any sort of viable understanding of how the streets can be a woman's space. And there's such a codified idea of a woman belongs in a home, therefore a homeless woman is so much more confrontational for different reasons, not for aggressive reasons, for sort of mindful and pensive reasons about, you know, what does this actually mean, and that there isn't really we police women off of the streets from the get-go. There's no viable place for them or reason for them to be there otherwise.
Right, and they're often seen in images of mothers. They're always with young children, because it never could be an issue just for them to be by themselves. Like, how could a woman be by themselves? And women in fear in cities too. right? Like, women should have never been alone in the city, and, you know, what is a working girl, and there's some. In terms of the public, people love to talk about the public, I guess, when that started in the late 90s and the 00s. A lot of literature wound up becoming about the public, and there's actually very little in the private, or privates. But it's all about publics and production of publics, and the obsession with publics also says a lot about what's being privatized and taken away. Like our education systems, for example. 70% of faculty at NYU are adjuncts, right? So where if LGBTQ studies comes through a lot through education systems and through higher ed, how will that continue to reproduce itself if it's not getting jobs and living in a constant state of precarity to even eat or drink? There's a lot of systems falling apart, but these kind of publics, usually we go back to the parks, but he pulls out many different kinds of publics and these kind of spaces that people found. Do you feel like you still have access to these publics? Or public space in New York? Like when it's not Fashion Week, you can go to Bryant Park, or...
So they moved that to the back corner of Lincoln Center.
Oh, that was good.
So now you just have this stupid skating rink set up.
Yes, the skating rink. So the privatization of public parks in New York City actually has really affected a lot of things, like when you can go and what you can do. And now there's these beautiful chairs. There's a lot of talk about Bryant Park and people looking up in Bryant Park. But where I can't imagine where that would be right now. So, I mean, they cut everything down where anyone could hide, and there's a lot of, like, that's repeatedly happened. I think if you were in New York even 10 years ago, Washington Square Park was so different. Like, you'd walk through and everyone would offer you marijuana, and there were really dark places, and the lights were broken, and people were hooking up in the bushes. And that's absolutely impossible and incredibly well lit, and NYU has bought everything around it. But other parks remain completely.
Yeah, I think as the notion of the public as it's changing, right? It's not for people to gather there as a public, right? It's like a lot of these changing structures are for people simply to move through, right? Like in Wash Park where you could sit around the fountain previously, like now you can't, right? Where Bryant Park, you could sit on the lawn, sometimes you can, sometimes it's roped off, and you may never know. And you see these happening, right? The piers, like, when the grassy, right, the need to cut off grass in the city is just insane. But it's like all public spaces in the city, it's suddenly where there's grass, it's where you can't sit, where it's like kind of cordoned off. So I think that's an interesting, right? And what is the threat behind people sitting, convening, right? What type of contact is lost?
Right, and the erasure of any kind of bench where you could lie down, which was a fear of homelessness and the regulation of homelessness. And I don't know if you even knew, but last year there were 1 million trees. There was a 1 million tree initiative in New York City. You know they planted 1 million trees? Right, they did not plant them in parks because then they would have obscured things. They were mostly planted on streets, and a lot of them weren't given the right care, so they're just going to put everywhere.
One important thing to remember is it wasn't the disappearance of Times Square, the disappearance of benches, it was the displacement of. And so I read an interesting article a long time ago in the New York Times about how Times Square moved to Queens. A lot of the sex work has been relocated to, I believe it's called Roosevelt Avenue. Yeah. So I live in Queens, so I was kind of interested in that, and interested in Delaney's whole thing of you're more likely to meet a famous writer now. I was like, well, not anymore. Like, you know, we've all sort of, Philly is a new Brooklyn or what have you, you know. But so it's important to sort of remember that move of displacement. That it's just been shifted. It's just we don't see it anymore in Manhattan. Manhattan is just not what it used to be at all.
Or Manhattan under 110th Street, or
right,
yeah,
exactly.
So it really strikes me how much of this cleaning up is a way of turning public spaces into amenities for upper middle class people and their real estate.
With their Wi-Fi and their coffee.
And in a funny way that goes back to, of all people, Jane Jacobs and her complaint about the plans to redo the village and eliminate the streetscape. And so it really has a lot to do with getting people and activities that don't look like middle class out of the way.
And it's also funny, I mean, I don't know how much you know about Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, but he really believed in miasma was the thing. You know, I don't know if you know about miasma. It was this horrible disease that floated in the air, and it was before they understood germs. So miasma was like how everyone got sick. And poor people had a lot of miasma, and people of color had a lot of miasma because they lived close together, they were unsanitary, and they came from foreign lands, and they were all very wrong. And Central Park was supposed to air them out, right? They were like literally, he wrote about this, and in a very noble way that the poor would go in and kind of air out on the weekends, and this would create less illness and sickness, and they would see upper middle class people go by in their horse carriages and learn, you know, how to act. But in a cross-class context of training and teaching, and you know, and he also did very beautiful things with design, but that's you know where a lot of that comes from. And we think that I mean, so Central Park wasn't there until, does anyone remember? 1870s? Can't believe I don't know off the top of my head. But when it was constructed, I mean, like those boulders are intentionally placed, right? You know, they look like they've been there forever, but they were intentionally placed and sculpted. And he has a way with design and carving the eye, and that actually worked for cruising in a really awesome way, because you're never gonna look there, like as much as you try. And Riverside Park, because I don't know if many people, the idea of all these sailors, I mean, there was actually like more of a functional use to these places that's really gone and high end. Like we talked about Christopher Street Piers especially, where people can go.
I loved how in Chauncey there, I forget the name, but there was like a specific statue that like had sailors in the name, and I was like,
Sailors and Soldiers Monument.
Yeah, like that was where
That's around like 110. Yeah, I remember finding it after reading this and was really excited. There was no one there, but I was in the middle of the day.
I wonder how the culture of surveillance also affects now cruising, and that's a hot topic I know to talk about, like that we're constantly being surveilled, like are queer subjects more likely to be objects of surveillance in those spaces? Because as you said, like, you know, we're designing spaces for maximum visibility so that we can see everything that's going on. And so it's kind of interesting how that's a class, race, sexuality issue as well.
Yeah. I think when we're like looking at the West Village and the surveillance of like youth of color particularly, right, it goes hand in hand with like this sanitization of space, right? If you want to make a public space seem safer, right, then you police queer people of color, right? Especially if there is some type of, right, people of color are already soon hypersexual in certain ways, but queer youth of color carrying that, right? It's like, especially in the West Village, where the current kind of trend is like, oh, right, this isn't, what's the use of queer space, right? Where the idea is that we're approaching some sense of normativity, and we're like everyone else, so there's no need for like queer space anymore, so we need to normalize it, right? And who do you police or survey to normalize space so that it's usable for a public or the public?
Yeah. And Jane Toole makes that comment about where she just felt like disowned from the LGBTQ community when she couldn't sleep outside gay spaces anymore.
Yeah.
I was like, we had our own churches, you know, that's what I thought. I was like, oh, that's so sad. And I couldn't even imagine anyone would ever do that. Like that was, I thought that was kind of nice. We keep talking about these queer youths of color. Where are these white youths hanging out? I'm just wondering, because we keep talking about the intersection of the disadvantaged, and it's also happening to queer people of color and to all kinds of youths. And I'm wondering, like, how that happens at all different scales, and how queer people of color are just policed more or policed differently, or how they feel comfortable coming out or in different groups. I was thinking about how a lot of Indian women contacted me about being in my study, but didn't want to be out and didn't want to be in a focus group. Because because they just didn't want to run into somebody else they might know who was also Indian, and they did, that their, you know, that their mother might tell them. That I actually had 2 people say this to me, and I just thought about that. And, all this is yes.
We've done some work with these homeless youth, specifically for youth, and part of it, especially like specifically in New York, is that there's different sections on where people hang out. So like a lot of the white kids hang out at Union Square, up in Times Square. This was just 2 years ago, so not much had possibly changed, other than the curfews.
Yeah.
So now there's curfew in Union, which there was never a curfew in the history of Union Square Park. So you have people who used to go there and sleep. And I think another factor in terms of like where the white graves are is that they get accepted in shelter systems and the transition housing. Like even Cali County Center, like stuff that the police of color have told me about the way they're treated there and how easy it is to get kicked out of there. Meanwhile, you get like a cute little gay white boy who's homeless and he gets passed through in the transition housing and so forth. So there's that. I mean, like, you know, racism hasn't necessarily been challenged within our community at all, even though we talk about challenging homophobia in communities of color. We don't really talk about challenging racism.
And we haven't. I mean, a lot of the reasons, if you feel the need or the urge, or you have the time to go read about the records of ACT UP, or the records of lesbian leaders, the records of insert any big group that gets big in here, the end is a lot about race and class. Like it's always about race and class, over and over and over again. And that's where we get stuck. We haven't moved past. If we were British, we would talk about how we haven't moved past class. So I just want to give this a shout out for talking about race. I also want to add that Union Square Park, of all parks, that has this massive radical history. It was also was the heart of all unions in New York City, and it was surrounded by all these unions that would meet there, and unions where you would go and like Woody Guthrie would come and hang out and he'd play music, and they were like places where you could learn to paint for free and hang out with your friends. I mean, these were places where you shared skills and learned skills. You know, what were you going to say, Trina?
Yeah, I was going to say, I know we're talking a lot about the systems of policing and spaces and also identities, but also a lot of the social systems and the way that they're set up. Like even currently, housing subsidies are only available to, I think it's 3 groups of women, or, yeah, okay, I'll remember. 3 groups of people. One of them is women and children, I believe. Another group is victims of domestic violence, and then I believe there's a 3rd group that kind of escapes me at the moment, but like currently Section 8 is closed, and that would allow you know, people to, the waiting list is closed in New York.
The housing subsidy section.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I know some people who said, yeah, I lived with a friend, I lived on couches for about 3 months, and then I learned that if you go into the shelter system, and if you just stay there for 1 month, then you're able to get what you need. You know, so I think it's also a matter of like how these, you know, whether it's the mayor, the governor, or how funding gets, you know, it gets navigating social systems. That it's a big way that a lot of the demographics. Kind of,
right, and it's not, and we keep going back to police, but there's so much about housing that's not like lost.
Right, and funding.
Yeah.
Funding. Yeah, I think it's a lot about funding.
I think there's sort of a queer effect to that, because then you have people living in different configurations that they wouldn't be living in otherwise. Like you have parents and children living together, or like friends like living together in spaces that were only meant for 1 person become spaces for 5. Like it's
a
just
new tenement.
Right, exactly. And that becomes sort of queer in the sense of being not normative. So we have all these different, and so at the same time that we're having this sort of fight for marriage equality now in Minnesota, I think today.
Where's it today?
Yesterday. That was yesterday's news.
I
can't keep up with it. No, and that's what Jay Toole brings up too, is she's very angry that this has become our single focus when we have so many other more pressing things to consider. But it's sort of interesting how it queers space too, right? And the house, the home.
And I think there have always been queer houses, but I can't remember Lauren's last name. We met at a conference and she's usually watching. And she is a photographer and she shoots queer houses and goes around and she just kept naming them. I was at the one and I said, oh, there's one right by me. She just kept naming them in Flatbush. And I was like, no, it's not that one, it's not that one, it's not that one. And I knew of about 5 and she named all these like a dozen other ones. So there's just, that those are growing. I think they've always been there, but there's something different about the way that they're operating and a lot about trans life and transgender life that moves through those spaces and is attached to those spaces, and making homes and communities and family, making family.
Well, just like talking about queer spaces and like queer public areas, I think it's interesting like to look not just at spaces that are already built, but like spaces that are planned for the city and how they're represented and like what's supposed to be going on there like in the future. And I work for a like architectural media website, so like I see this all the time, and like architecture itself is just dominated by like white, typical gay straight men. I mean, gay straight men. It's dominated by like white straight men, and even designing spaces like the New York City AIDS Memorial that's coming up in 2 years.
Where's that going to be?
Right across from St. Vincent's in the Village, in this like triangle area.
So that where all the locks were after 9/11 and all the
right.
The one across the street,
where two
not south of it. The one just
northwest corner.
Yes.
And then that little community garden is what's there now.
Okay.
Right.
But it's mostly the utility plans. It just looks
Yes,
like an
the
ugly,
utility, yeah.
low brown brick thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Well, it's just funny seeing the renderings because, you know, they're talking about these spaces that are supposed to be for, like, queer people, but they look nothing queer at all. Like, the activities being pictured in the renderings are just, like, people enjoying the sun and, like, sitting there with like, a shopping bag and drinking coffee on the AIDS Memorial. And, like, even the AIDS Memorial itself is, like, very, like, sleek and chic looking and, like, sexy. And it's, like, not, like, it doesn't even look like a memorial. It's like a pavilion to just, like, go have lunch underneath. And, like, in the pictures, there's, like a hot air balloon like in the sky, and it's just like so funny to see how people like represent what's supposed to be going on when you know it's supposed to be public space and it's never going to be what you think it is. Even like the new pavilion at Fire Island that's being built, they talk about like when they're describing it, they're talking about all these spaces built into the structure to like let people meet each other and like eventually hook up, but they don't like say that right away. They say like, you know, meet somebody and like mingle. And, I mean that's built into the history of like Fire Island, but the way they present it, it's like people are just like a DJ, like, you know, getting people to dance, and it's like really pretty. And like, oh, we can like take our family here, but it's the pavilion at Fire Island, and it's just even in like the way that things are projected in the future are still kind of monitored and how they're supposed to be used. It's fun to like look at every day and be enthusiastic about it.
Right.
That's all for developer money though. I mean, all of those like renderings, the whole goal of that and those projects in specific they were not built with money previously invested in it. So they're looking, that's all of that is ad brochure.
Right,
Trying to appeal to somebody with the biggest paycheck who can say, yes, I spent the summer out on Fire Island and I'm glad to see it's cleaned up now. And oh, that looks like a fun place to have a drink now. And it's, you know, you're not going to invest in some tawdry place where, you know, anything can happen. You're gonna take.
Well, but
your money can be tracked. Your money can be tracked. So if you're putting your name on that building, if say that's the end goal, your name is going on the building where the people have tawdry sex. So I mean, all of that is. I mean, they're speculative projects that are trying to get money. Which is kind of. Right.
And a lot of most of the buildings built in Times Square, which Delaney talks about in the other part of the book or later in the book, is are mostly paid for by the city of New York that sponsor and give these contractors these incredible deals and really cheap real estate and so many tax breaks, and then they turn around and sell this at a premium because New York City needs more, or you know, through Giuliani, through Bloomberg, wanted more business real estate. And that's what's to happen to the Fulton Street Mall in Brooklyn, which is one of the oldest African-American shopping districts and one of the still few places you can still barter in the city. this is a shopping district where people know one another and talk to one another, and that is supposed to be just closed down, and people have been working on it for years to put up more high rises, to have low rent business places like skyscrapers, you know, that you can actually afford to make a new business district. But a business district is never really low rent for very long, and right. So, yeah. You were going to say something before that?
So I'm kind of interested in divisions within queer community, especially when queer homeless youth are involved. So I also volunteered for a bit with the CLAGS Center and then worked there. And I think it's interesting because, I don't know, so you have, for the most part, these poor kids of color, and the staff, many of whom are people of color, but are from a different class background, not all of them, but many of them are. And one would hope, so I talked with a lot of the residents who lived there about how they felt that there was this really, really huge division between the residents and the staff members. And often they were policed by the staff members and felt persecuted by them, many of whom were queer themselves, if not the majority of them. And I don't know, so I feel like it's interesting when we have these spaces where there could potentially be, I don't know, this like community building, this organizing and this empowering of young people, we are instead shutting them down and keeping them in these positions where they're not becoming any more empowered or like, I don't know, gaining the confidence and the skills they need to become people in the world. After, for most of, like talking to tons of these residents, like for most of their lives, they've been shat on for the fact that they're queer, like of color and like of like a certain class. And I think it's really unfortunate, and I'm not exactly sure why the people who were in the positions of power were not doing more to lift these other members of our community up. Yeah, and some of the staff members had come from similar backgrounds as residents they were working with, but there was still that divide and there was still that othering. And so, yeah, that's just something I was thinking about.
And youth of color being disenfranchised in every single way. I mean, going to school, maybe you told me about this, that there's the school in the Bronx where you have to get there an hour in advance to go through the metal detectors because the line is so long, right? And so you leave there, you leave this place where you're policed, and you go to this other place, you're policed. Yeah. Literally.
And your privacy is completely taken away from you. So when you first enter the system, you are in a room with all these other people and you have like a little pod where you can sleep. But until you get to the upper levels of transitional housing, you don't have a room with a door. And so like the breakdown between like public and private, like yes, you are inside a house, but you still don't have any private space. And so many of, I mean, I get that there's a lot of problems with the shelter system in general, and that this is a better, and I've talked with kids, or I don't know, a lot of them are about my age, so I can't really call them kids, but a lot of residents for whom the CLAGS Center, like these queer spaces are a million times better than the religious spaces they were in, where especially for trans folks, like showering was a living hell, and like they were treated horribly, but still in these like supposedly queer and like queer friendly spaces, there's still this policing and, I don't know, violence done against these people in spaces where they should feel safe.
I was just going to say, I'm sharing a little inside info. I'm a faculty member at BMCC, everyone very well Manhattan, Tribeca, and we have a very strong Safe Zone Ally program, which I'm a member of. I don't know if you guys know what that is. It's like, you know, you take a little training, you have a rainbow sticker on your office, and anyone who feels like they're being harassed or bullied can come in. They don't have to talk to you, we're not really counselors, but they can just find a safe place. But what's interesting, and we have a very, very strong supportive administration for LGBT issues. We used to have a week, now we have an entire month of LGBT awareness. But, and I hope I'm correct on this, but it goes back to the fact that a few years back, I mean way back, we've always had an LGBT club, but what happened was, and there's always club space, it's always the same time on every campus, every week, the students were going to the LGBT club, and of course the room was advertised, and as they were going into the room, there were students from the conservative Christian club who were greeting them and telling them that they shouldn't go there and they were bad and so forth. And they were like really trying to discourage the students from going into the gay club. So I think that, you know, word got back obviously with club advisors, and the administration, you know, sort of responded by just making the school like have this really big gay presence. I mean, we have LGBT Awareness Month. I mean, there's flyers all over and there's a big info fair. And so I thought that was like a really good way of responding, because I mean, it would make other students realize that, you know, you shouldn't be interfering with someone else's club. I mean, you can go to your conservative Christian club, fine, but don't tell the gay kids they can't go to their meeting. So, I mean, I think that's good, and I think on my campus is probably has one of the strongest, support systems for gay kids in the city, and it is predominantly students of color who go to BMCC.
So what else about J-Tool were you guys thinking? What else stuck out to you? This vast inequalities. Homelessness is becoming more of an issue, right? Suddenly, we keep talking about it, we keep going back, we know that's the group that's being, I don't want to say the most, or but we frame it that way when we keep talking about it. Also, we came up a lot in the beginning with issues of gentrification. But for me, I was thinking about what Jay carries, like all this, like the residue of carrying that, having that phone on all the time. There's a lot of pressure I always had to be on, and I was just like thinking, I was like, oh, what does Sarah Schulman carry, and Jonathan Negmatz, and David Halperin, and John Amelia, Maxine Wolf, Deb Adel. I'm just thinking what they carry and what they refuse to give up. There's a really brilliant book by Anne Chang called The Melancholia of Race, about how just the pain and the suffering and the anger and the oppression also gets passed on generation to generation. There's this like residue. And mourning and melancholia to Freud, mourning was something you got over, and melancholia you never got over. So simple. And after I read that, I was thinking about the melancholia of homosexuality, and I would use that word for, comparing. But it's without biological families to pass on. So how we pass on what we carry, also in relationships, in our friendships. I'm always surprised to find when straight people don't know that there's domestic violence in LGBTQ relationships. That is so strange, What rock did you just crawl out from under? Or the increased health issues that are faced, or addiction issues. And these things are all prevalent and just everywhere Jay goes. So,
I think it's interesting when Jay, or when whoever wrote this, talked about the different topics that we're missing from our queer history, and how we have this narrative or like this history of like queer pride and like gay pride, and there are these things that we don't want to incorporate into our history, like pain and shame, but that these are really important things that we should be paying attention to. And so who are the people, there have been people that have been left out of our queer history in the past, and who are the people that are being left out of our queer present, or like who are the groups that aren't being represented in this moment. And I give those people a voice.
There's a really good book called Archive of Trauma on Lesbian Public Cultures by Anne Svetkovich.
Yeah, Archive of Feelings.
Archive of
Sorry,
Feelings.
Archive of
There's mad
Feelings.
trauma in there.
Yeah, there's mad trauma.
Yeah, trauma's really big in English, or it was like 3 or 5 years ago, so all the English people are about trauma.
Right.
So, in case you want to read about trauma. Yeah.
I like what you were saying about the melancholia, and I'm thinking maybe so much internal policing happens in our various communities to each word are, is part of that melancholia, right? And I think, right, maybe that's where things are happening in the shelter, right? I even think about like the idea behind the It Gets Better campaign, and how like the goal might be in a sense to try to alleviate trauma, right? Or with this like narrative of we all suddenly end up at some point over the rainbow, right? Or something like that. It gets better for everyone. Might come from this pace of, right, like of trying to hide that melancholia or shame while it's actually like producing it differently in other ways, right? Or where does it, right, if you try to pretend it's not there, or that for everyone and everything gets better, then where's the melancholia going?
Yeah, why does Dan Savage have to yell at everyone? I don't get it. I mean, I do. I think that's kind of, telling someone it's got to be this way and fitting to a certain idea of getting better.
Right.
Yeah.
I think like our history, you have to sort of search for that melancholia in some ways. Like it's not always present.
Right, and do you want it? It's like, oh,
Well,
you know.
like watching that United in Anger documentary the other night.
Oh, yeah, tell us about that. Yeah.
Oh, it was amazing. I think that for those of us who didn't protest during that time, we forget what a sort of central point it was for gay culture, not only for political activism, but for cruising. Because the meetings themselves became sites of like sexuality and like desire and, you know, that was part of the energy. It was a young, sexy movement, you know. I thought that was a really interesting aspect, sort of going along with the conversation. But we lost, you know, a whole generation, which I think we don't often see it in those terms. And not only that, but how the movement also derived strength from the women's health movement. A lot of the rhetoric from the women's health movement, but also issues for women surrounding straight versus queer women's needs in the women's health movement. Like it I think exposed, like the ACT UP years, I think exposed a lot of the fragilities of the system. And the way the movement broke down, I think it was interesting, like the way it was sort of explained, or the way Sarah Schulman explained, although she got a little shady about it because she knew something that sort of we didn't know about, the ways it broke down certain individuals' roles and the ways the movement kind of broke down. But the difference between people who were there to get drugs into bodies and sort of in an immediacy, a sense of like saving one's own life, saving the life of one's lover, et cetera. People who really wanted major structural change in the healthcare and the social systems. So I think that's how that sort of anyway, it was really amazing. And I don't think it's, like I was saying to you, I don't think it's always available, so it was kind of fun to see.
One of the other things about that film, since we're talking about the public and the private today, is that what so many of the people were after was getting more transparency with healthcare and getting the things that were so very private to become more public, like in terms of the pharmaceutical companies and things of that nature. So it was a real call, you know, for more information and more transparency, and to get the you know, the term AIDS to include, you know, women, and, you know, it's like it was fascinating in that way. And they, during the protest, like claimed all these different spaces, the church, I mean, the streets, I mean, all these. Yeah. They popped up on the CBS Evening News, and Dan Rather was like, we're going to break, you know? And they popped up,
like they photocopied IDs, like someone had worked at CBS, and so they faked all these IDs, which you can't do anymore. So they got entry into the building and stormed the set of the Evening News and just like popped up and said AIDS. And then Dan Rather was like, because they knew that if they could get that word out, that would have meant something. If that was the only word they could get out, that was what they wanted to get out. And then they were like, we're going to commercial. It was pretty amazing, yeah.
This kind of immediacy and big structural change. Thinking about last week, we were talking about the professionalization, I think we called it, professionalization of advocacy in this way, and also the fact that you brought up earlier, about an hour ago, I think it was, that there are more posters for, you know, call us when you need, you know, assistance out of the shelter, but the shelters are closing down. I feel like there's, I don't know if complacency or, you know, is the right term for it, but I feel like there's this maybe a sense that, oh, there are organizations for, you know, that there's this kind of like, oh, that's taken care of. There are organizations that do that full time, or you know what I mean? Like, I feel like even still, we live very much in a culture that, you know, oh, Sylvia Rivera Law Project's got that. I don't need to, you know, or
I don't need to report this time somebody spat on me because AVP's got all that data.
Right. Or that we have these organizations that deal with that kind of thing. So I don't know. I feel
so like Jay says, there's a dearth of data. You know, I love data, and it's not there. You know, we can produce it if we want.
And I'm just wondering if that affects us on like a kind of interpersonal level, where some of the things, because I know so much of our culture right now is so very individualized, right? And I'm wondering if sometimes we don't see the structural, the systemic pieces of it because we're,
Yeah, I was thinking about like how you pay for healthcare. I love Planet Money podcast. I just sing the song to them. And there was this great one about how much we pay when we go to the hospital or the doctor. And this guy followed, it was the Time magazine article that was like a mini book, and about how, it matters what your insurance is, but then people in Medicaid are actually, or Medicare, really paying the general rate. You pay like $4 for an aspirin or $7.50 for a cotton swab or when you're in the hospital. And how we don't even know, right? And that's happening to everybody. And maybe, maybe the inequality will get big enough where we're all thinking, I don't want to pay $7.50 for that cotton swab. What are you paying? Like we're all forced to talk about it. Somebody was going to talk. You wasn't you, Nick?
Yeah, I can't get that article from the first class out of my mind, which is like, I don't remember anything about it, but it was basically, the crux of it was, like, this whole gay thing has only been around for a very short time. Which is like, and I can't help but think about that with regard to like the private public sort of thing in the sort of like the now and back in the day that we're reading about. Right. And I feel like I feel like in a certain sort of way, like in the current day, gays are really struggling with like how to kind of like cast themselves and like how to pay and how to symbolize what being gay is and the AIDS memorial and like kind of like coming off as palatable. But like back in the day when you were cruising, the only thing you could be was sexual, and gay and kind of like and I feel like it's kind of like in the sort of like time that I've been alive, being gay, and like from when I was born, like being gay, the meaning of being gay has changed like dramatically. And I just feel like we're totally like always sort of like changing. And I feel a large amount of certainty about the future of what being gay means.
And we'll be around forever.
Like, yeah.
Think about this.
Yeah. No, but basically it's like, when we come from this sort of like, in certain ways it may have been more diverse at a certain sort of time, but I feel like I have a certain diversity in, my gay contacts I don't have in my professional contacts or, college contacts or that sort of stuff. And so I kind of am like, is that going to exist in 100 years from now? And I can't remember. And there was this one article from college, and the crux of it was, and I believe that this is a real article. I'm hoping I didn't. But like, it was this article called like, "Am I Gay Black or Black Gay?" Like, and kind of like about the ordering of identities, and kind of like, and basically the thing was that like Black gay men, or people who had sex, men who had sex with men who were Black, basically had to like choose whether they were going to like codify the masculine identity and remain a part of the the racial in-group, or whether they're going to like or if they were just femme, they were pushed to the outer side of the race group, and they kind of like became an out group, but joined like white society and stuff like that. And I feel like, and thinking about colorblindness and like how like race operates in America, and like the sort of like the like white being sort of like the default color of American society. It's like a gay youth who's like 14 or 18 now is just gay. Like, I feel like a person of color has to be like, gay Asian or something like that. And I feel like I'm worried about the future in that sort of regard with like, I don't know.
Separating. There were like people, yes, you and
I just want to say, when we were talking about healthcare costs before, a lot of the data actually was released recently. I will try to find the link and send it to you so you can post it. But it was, the example they gave was like it was examining the New York metro area, and it was like a certain kind of lung disease. The same treatment at a health center in the Bronx was like $11,000, and at a health center in New Jersey was $90,000 for the same thing. So I think that actually could start to change now that a lot of the data has been released.
Yeah, just a few of the comments have made me think about production of memory and how individual memory and how we remember our own experience, and then how that either is similar or contrasts to collective memory, and what is chosen to be remembered and what's not, and what's left out of history, and how that then is, continued, and whether or not, like, within the canon versus, individual stories, and how, especially with technology, how that, progresses, and what that'll look like in the future.
And that goes a lot with temporality too, like the tendency of drugs in the bodies right now, we're looking at the structural issue, and we were talking about temporality last week, and I was thinking about the temporality of how these men met, which is very like night or weekends, or different seasons, or different events, or and how much of that's really changed, right, for us, I don't know. And this gay that was created back here, back in the day, how much we keep repeating it, and our compulsion to repeat. Yes, there was Karen.
Well, I was going to respond to what you were saying. Like, one of the things that I was asking Sarah Schulman about with ACT UP is, like, could ACT UP occur again, or what do we do to sort of create more momentum politically? And she basically was pretty blunt about it. She just said queer has no radical potential anymore whatsoever. It's co-opted. Like, we've been co-opted. We can only be powerful now in the context of a coalition movement. And so I'm still sort of, and we didn't parse it out too much, but I was just, and she also thinks that we don't have creativity anymore in our activism, which I thought was interesting way of looking at it, that's one of the reasons why ACT UP and Lesbian Avengers, for example, like, they had sort of a creative potential to them. And I don't know if that relates to co-optation or not, but I don't know, I was anxious to sort of bring that to class because I was wondering if we feel that queer has been co-opted, or if we feel like there's some, because I still like to sort of think that there's something there that can be accessed that's not co-opted, but maybe not.
Yeah. I think queer has been co-opted. I don't.
Thank you, Prince.
I don't think that means it has no radical potential. Right. I think that's like, I don't know, Sarah Schulman has her own beliefs.
Yeah.
Things, so. Right. But that I don't always agree with.
Yeah.
So, but I do think there's definitely radical potential to it, and like with the creativity piece, I think we are creative in a lot of ways. It's just really localized, and we need to like remember that like the queers aren't going to ever work on the HRC level. And we're gonna have to do it in our small scale things, and that's how you make changes. That's how we started. Why can't we, continue that way?
I think we're really creative. We're still alive.
Oh yeah. I was really upset by the comment, by the way. So I thought of bringing here more as like I'm having trouble with this.
Tag and Dyke and
right.
Let's go. Like I think they all do, and if we deploy them, let's take gay back. Let's go get homo even. Like let's go. Way back.
Homophile.
This is really more of a question. The question is, a lot of what's described in Chauncey is bottom up and sort of widespread and diffuse and not managed by anybody. And I wanted to ask people who say it's co-opted or worried about this, what's the mechanism? Who's doing the co-opting? I mean, is it some outsider, or is it some tendency in us to try to find people like us, or to make things easy, or to just, want to know we can get our little whatever it is, whether it's affection or sex, and not worry about the rest of it? What's the mechanism of being co-opted? It's easy to say it's been co-opted, but how?
That we're back to capitalism. Okay, what were you guys gonna say?
I was gonna say that I think like going off of what you were saying and what Nick was saying too, with the coalition building, I think that's definitely something really that needs to happen, and also kind of addressing a lot of the white privilege and racism and classism that goes on in these big organizations, and also on the smaller levels, like within here in New York City, what are the class divides that are happening between the groups that are organizing it, and how can we address that, like really bringing it back to like SNCC and the philosophies of SNCC. I'm a student nonviolent coordinating committee, civil rights movement, radical movement. Anyways, they, really looking at kind of these ways that people used ways to build coalitions and kind of moving forward with that in the spaces now. And going off of what you're saying too, with I think queer being co-opted, I think some of it is the technology, and some of it is, when we start these things in small spaces, the the localization of it is great, but it also has that potential of becoming co-opted, and that's what happens when we move outside those local spaces. And so that's what happened, you know, and then that just continues on. So it's kind of that calling out, I think, then, and bringing it back to being like, well, what do you mean when you just say I'm queer, but you're not really going along with what other people are thinking is queer, and kind of having discussions about that.
I'm gonna briefly intersect. I mean, like, how many op-eds do you read in the New York Times about real queer ideas? I mean, like, they're just
They don't even use the word.
They don't.
No.
You can count these as there's less than a dozen. I actually count them. Like, there's. I know how often lesbian, dyke, fag, gay, like all of them are used. And, and homosexuals only used in the case of the, like, I would say like 90-95% of the time in the use of the Catholic Church. But
yeah, I was gonna say something similar, that like I don't think that the necessity of coalition-based activism is a bad thing. I think that if queer spaces have become dominated by white queers and academic queers, then I don't feel attached to those spaces and that kind of politics. So I just feel differently about what you said Sarah Schulman was talking about. And not to say that that's what happened with ACT UP.
What did you feel different? Which part? About her or about what Karen said? I lost.
So, Sarah Schulman, I think you were saying Sarah Schulman said.
Well, but the question was whether ACT UP could occur again in the same way. And her response was no, because of the co-optation of queer, lesbian, gay, et cetera, et cetera. And it wasn't just queer, it was the entire panorama of terms. And so it would not be in the same sort of for queer community, by queer community, the way ACT UP was. So it would have to be in conjunction with another movement.
Yeah, I mean, I also feel like it's just we're not in the same historical context as when ACT UP happened, which I don't think that's what you were saying, but I do think that there is a lot of like coalition-based activism involving a lot of queer people and to benefit queer people that probably, isn't getting recognized the same way ACT UP is getting recognized now retroactively. You know what I mean? Like I see that happening in anti-prison movement a lot. So.
Trina was next.
Yeah. I could be wrong about this, but I feel like the unsettling thing about that comment is perhaps the assumption that we were once outside of something that existed, instead of the fact that like the margins do create the center and the center creates the margins, and it's really a kind of relationship to that, you know what I mean? Because I feel, when I had this like, oh wow, but I think it's a matter of kind of seeing it that way.
You're so so good at saying these things that just get us all right.
I know, we're all set.
Well, I feel like you and I are sort of saying similar things, but like, why would we want ACT UP to happen in the same way? There have been major criticisms of it. It was overwhelmingly white. It was upper class gay men. And the moment that they were not the main people who were dying, then the epidemic was over. And I didn't see the same documentary you saw, but I saw one that's often shown with it, right? The How to Survive a Plague.
Yeah.
And one of the main images they used in front of the CDC was of a lynching. And it was just so clear that it was like, this is an image that you think is fine because this is a group of white gay men who think that like this is meaningful to say like we're gonna lynch you, the CDC, and say that means that like we have power over you. So why would we want it to happen in the same way? And I don't really want to like, start a fight with Sarah Schulman, but like, sort of, taking it away from her saying that, I think that like, it's great that it would have to be coalition-based today. I don't think it actually would, but if it did, that would be wonderful. And so what we were saying, but like that's not a weakness, and I don't think that's competition.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know if I should say it, I feel like it's taking in a slightly different direction because a couple of the comments that were made sort of made me think about like hyper-local like queer and gay communities. And so you were talking about neighborhoods and you were talking about margins informing mainstreams. And I just thought it would be interesting to note, and obviously many people don't probably know there's like sort of these weird like queer factions that exist in the city. And so there's like Hell's Kitchen gays and Bushwick gays and like Astoria gays and Jackson Heights gays, and they all have different bars and they all have different feels to them. And I was just thinking about how like structurally there's those things going on, and then like on the sort of national level, you'll have like HRCs. But then in terms of margins informing mainstreams, one of the things that I'm really interested in is transformative justice work and community accountability and things like that. And there's like really interesting queer organizing. So for example, with ALP and their Safe Outside the System collective, which responds to incidents of hate violence by doing sort of educating people in their community, not necessarily queer people, but neighborhood store owners and business owners to talk about how to respond to incidents of violence when queer people are in trouble. And I think that model from ALP is something that really informs larger discussions. And so I went to this summit this weekend with a bunch of people in New York that are doing, transformative justice work, thinking about like sort of small people of color collectives to like the Challenging Male Supremacy Project, to Fierce, to Black Women's Blueprint, to my organization. So thinking about how like those conversations are continuing in this way that like there are queer communities doing stuff in their neighborhood in this sort of like very Brooklyn hyper-local kind of way that's like informing larger, even citywide and national conversations. And I just think if we're talking about, again, it's a different direction, but in the development of a queer city and then this conversation, I think it's somewhere, there's things going on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Schumann thing is so out there because there is all of that queer work that you just described that's happening. Yeah. But it's why I think context is important, right? And what Rebecca was saying about the history of ACT UP, right there. Pujar is term, or uses his term slow death, right? Mm-hmm. And I think with ACT UP and the AIDS movement, who it was happening to, right, mattered, and its immediacy mattered, right? Mm-hmm. But these issues that are kind of really the queer movement, maybe in some ways, I feel okay saying that right now, are issues of slow death that have always affected, like, working class communities and people of color communities and trans communities, right? They're about, like, a prolonged dying, in a way, right? A prolonged killing or taking away of your life chances, right? That and they're about survival in a different way and fighting in a different way. And it's still happening because it has to happen, right? In those communities and those spaces. But why isn't that seen as like, right? And this is what Jay Toole is saying, right? Like, why aren't we taking these on as queer issues? They obviously are. But there has to be a distance from those issues for the mainstream, like, gay movement to kind of be where it is, right?
I think I'm not totally decided on how this will go, but the thing about the potential that the AIDS epidemic raised was at the heart of it was there was an attack on the human body. It's attacking your very being, which would remove you from elements of class and race and all these other things. So there was this radical potential for, if it could happen to everybody, we all had to face it together. And and that was sort of the shift for attention that happened throughout the 80s. And when it became realigned to class biases of there was different levels of access that were available for drugs and whatnot, the realignment with your class structure and then the other identifications, you weren't fearing for your very existence, your bodily existence that was just getting by. You were then able to bring back all of those other things. And I think that's where some of the radical potential, the queer radical potential that maybe she's talking about, was lost because everyone was able to retreat they were able to go back into their bodies and assess what else was there available to them. So, it's...
Yeah, I'm having a brain jam. Anybody else want to jump in on that? Something to say to Sarah? Well, by the way, I thought it was so hard not to assign gentrification of the mind, which is really, really good if you haven't. and my American history is great and classic, but gentrification of mine came out, I think, last year, early this year, and it's very smart. Some of it you will surely disagree with. Yes, Kate?
I assume most people read the article in the Village Voice about Christine Quinn and how she's viewed by the gay community. I mean, I think that kind of ties in with the discussion we're having here, because I remember when she first of all, I can't believe she's only 46, because it seems like she's been around forever. But I remember when she first came on the scene, I mean, she was such a firebrand when she was with the Anti-Violence Project, when she was just getting started in New York. And it's just like been such a radical change. I mean, I guess you have to do that if you want to become the mayor, but it's just like, it kind of ties in. I feel like she's been co-opted to an extent. I mean, everyone thinks of her as Bloomberg's puppet, and I even name what she represents. So, I mean, I probably have other issues that are not gay related, but I mean, it just seemed like all the radical gays who were quoted in the article really had like major issues with her. Anyway, just throwing that out. It seems to fit in.
You should take a look at her wedding photos.
Yeah, I was reading the New York Times article about this week where she sort of came out and talked about her identity as an alcoholic.
Oh, right, and Believer.
As a
yeah,
believer,
that was,
yeah.
And the memoir's coming out too.
And I linked to their New York Times wedding from last year or whatever, and I was just like, as they say, she's gay but not okay or whatever, like people that are against her. She may be gay, but she's not okay.
Yeah, it was like, it was that, and if anybody read the Anthony Weiner Sunday Times Magazine article, where it was kind of like, it felt like this very obvious placement of, I'm gonna come back into politics, and you're probably not gonna like me, but I'm gonna show up, and here's my wife and my kid. But it felt like kind of that outing in a way, another outing, and I will bare my soul, and I will become more human because you think I am not. Right? Even though those are horrible, real life issues that she's going through. Christine Quinn for mayor. That's so interesting. I know. People get really excited, people not from here, like, then they say, isn't that great, you might have a lesbian mayor.
But Houston already has one.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
How's that going for them? Is that really?
She's really good. Like I'm Facebook friends with her.
Oh, we're right back to contact.
She's really
No, I think that's the network.
She's really proactive, and it's just like she seems like you know, for municipal. Like I don't have high expectations of municipal leaders, but she's pretty good. Like I know, there's a friend of mine who lives in Houston who was an early gay rights activist who helped me document some of the stuff from the 60s about my great aunt. He was a grad student of Karen Horney's, and he went back and forth out of jail in Texas, and he was kind of like the longtime leader of the gay rights movement in Texas. He was the only gay one. And so now he's like the police community liaison. So it's like, yay, the most credible gay activist in the state, she appointed to where he's like, you know, had a complete reversal from his relationship with the cops in the, for the last, 50 years.
Right.
So she's, but most of her Facebook tweets or Facebook updates are about, vote for Houston so we can get this grant, or vote, or like, you fill out this survey and tell us about your recycling habits. So it's like, it's actually like, that's what I want as a mayor. And like about Christine Quinn, I think it's good that we have a lesbian mayor, but I don't think she's any better or worse than all the other people running.
Yeah, we used to, that was an idea though. There was a really strong idea of that in the 90s by having gay politicians, that it would mean so much. I don't know if you guys know a lot about the Gay and Lesbian Victory Fund, but that's something interesting to look up about. I was reading their website in detail and I had no idea, but they put a lot of money into LGBT candidates. Well, that was in the Quinn article.
I think that's a big deal because because having like a lesbian in the Senate, it actually it changes the dialogue when there's actually are when we actually are part of an empowered majority.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'd like to have, I prefer it was a black lesbian in the Senate, but we like how many minorities are in the Senate, and let's whatever marginal gains we can actually get.
Yeah, I think that the difference is thinking that it's that there are changes, and does change the discourse, but I think in the 90s, I don't know, also I was a teenager, whatever, I thought that would be like some solution to something, right? I just thought it would get better. So sweet. But yeah, sorry, what were you gonna say?
I feel like I just need to like rail on her for a minute because on these things, I just like, I don't know, I feel like similar to the Victory Fund, like last year there was LPAC, like the lesbian super PAC that just formed that were like really proud of themselves because they gave, what's her name from Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin, they gave her more money than HRC and Victory Fund did, and it was like, oh cool, so now we're like playing the same like bullshit game, with electoral politics and like not changing the system. And I feel like that's like Chris Quinn is like I have to deal with a lot of her in my current position, and I work for this worker center project organizing low wage retail workers that's attached to a labor union that just endorsed her for mayor, which I remember, while we sat here for like 2 years and vehemently fought for the living wage bill, while she's the one person who wouldn't bring it to the table, and then like finally like watered it down so badly so it's affecting like 300 or 400 workers in the city, and then like because it's an election year, we were able to like push it push it through. And now she's taking credit for helping low-wage workers and trying to get our vote. She did the same exact thing with the paid sick days bill. And, there's all this like private money. It was like all Ford and Rockefeller money that was like funding like Working Families Party, funding me, funding everyone else to be able to work on all these issues of legislation, when it's like all of this like private money that came from really gross capitalist places that's like now like paying my salary in some way to do what the government's supposed to do, and she's sitting here taking credit for helping working people. She's been the one person getting in the way every time. And so for me, like I don't identify with her, and I would be so unhappy if she was the person who like didn't care about poverty in the city who's running it. Like I feel like poverty is
a queer
issue.
Yes.
I just can't handle her,
Yeah.
So I don't know if people need to look at her awful track record maybe before they.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a sort of a personal sort of understanding, is that I think when I was young, there was such an absence of openly queer identities, and they existed in the world, like in literature, but they were so few in popular culture that I thought that, sort of if there was a visibility thing, that things would get better. Sorry for that. But I think what's happened sort of as I got older is that like neither race nor sexual orientation nor even class issues or whatever is dispositive of how I think that their record is going to be. It's not going to be the turning point. And I think it's sort of this like you're older and sadder but a little wiser kind of like like a really good coming of age romantic comedy. Like it's like this idea that like yes, I have these ideas about what a queer identity or what someone in a position of power would be like, but now it's like there's what it takes to get all of that power can be so destructive that it sort of silences those other identities, or they make them less important.
Like it's easy for her to do gay things that like, and it's easy for her to do with women's things like but
at this moment in time.
At this moment in time, but she's only doing it when it doesn't cost her anything, like when she, if it's not costing us, if it's not costing New York business, if it's not if it's not tied to all of the real estate developers that have their eye on New York City and like the shitty jobs they're coming here to create, it's like it's really easy for her to do gay shit and women's shit when it's like you only get votes for that and it's not costing anything. But
to be a convenient gay. So I know I want to bring us back to the street ever so briefly in concluding, and encourage you to enjoy your street walk home, and rolling and moving, and how we use our streets, and to think about that. We have a mere one class left. And next, I saved the best for last. I find neighborhoods so feisty to talk about. So the hyper-localized life of New York, we shall address, Brooklyn and otherwise, especially Brooklyn and otherwise. Amanda Lanson has this great piece about Jackson Heights, totally new temporality for you. And Gizani writes about the end of the neighborhood. Is it over? It's a very short, smart piece. He's a really smart sociologist. And then Mignon Moore, Lipstick or Timberlands, Black Gender Identity Presentation. And we're almost done, John.
Okay.
Thanks. And then I signed myself, which I don't know why I did that right now, but it's really funny. You can read about Park Slope. And that'll be, see what you think about Park Slope these days. So we'll go back for our same bad time at 6:30 p.m. and we'll be on the 9th floor. We have gone down to the depths and we will go up to the heights, the top floor, different rooms. 6:30 and room 906. Yes, Trina Rose, yes.
Okay.